They were brothers, inseparable since childhood until one rainy night changed everything. A single mistake, a single lie, and a bond built over years began to fall apart. But sometimes life's deepest pain becomes the path to forgiveness. This is the story of two brothers and the accident that changed their lives forever. The rain hadn't stopped for hours. The wipers on Daniel's old pickup truck struggled against the sheets of water that blurred the road ahead. Beside him sat his younger brother, Ethan, staring out the window, lost in thought. The two hadn't spoken much since they left their parents' farmhouse that evening, just an uneasy silence, thick with unspoken tension. Ethan was only 17, still trying to prove himself. Daniel, 5 years older, had always been the careful one. Responsible, protective, the kind of brother who tried to keep Ethan out of trouble. But that night, things were different. Ethan had begged Daniel to let him drive back home after their friend's late night bonfire, saying he was ready, that he wasn't a kid anymore. Daniel hesitated at first. The rain, the darkness, the sharp turns along the ridge road, it didn't feel right. But Ethan's confidence, his eagerness to be treated like an adult, finally wore him down. With a sigh, Daniel handed over the keys. As soon as Ethan got behind the wheel, he grinned, proud, nervous, excited. The truck roared to life, and they started down the winding road. For a few minutes, everything felt fine. The brothers even laughed about old childhood stories, their voices mixing with the sound of rain on the roof. Then, in a heartbeat, everything changed. A deer appeared from the trees, sudden, blinding in the headlights. Ethan panicked. The wheel jerked. The tires screamed. The truck spun across the slick road, skidding toward the guardrail. Daniel shouted Ethan's name, but before he could reach for the wheel, the truck slammed into the barrier. Metal crunched. Glass shattered. Then, silence. When Daniel opened his eyes, his world was sideways. The truck was resting against a tree, smoke rising from the hood. Pain burned through his shoulder. He looked over. Ethan was unconscious, a deep cut above his brow. Hey, wake up! Daniel's voice shook. He unbuckled himself, crawling toward his brother. Panic clawed at his chest. He could hear the rain again now, softer, crueler. Ethan groaned, blinking. What happened? Daniel forced a smile through his fear. You're okay. You're going to be okay. They were both lucky to be alive, but something had changed in that moment. The air between them, heavy, broken. Daniel blamed himself for letting Ethan drive. Ethan, dazed and scared, couldn't shake the image of Daniel's fearful eyes just before the crash. When the paramedics arrived, their parents soon followed. Their mother cried as Daniel was lifted into the ambulance. Their father said nothing, just stared at the mangled truck in disbelief. That night marked the beginning of something neither brother could undo. The physical wounds would heal, but the emotional ones, the guilt, the blame, the silence, would take years to mend. And as the ambulance lights faded into the storm, Ethan made a silent promise to himself, one born from fear and confusion, that would haunt their relationship for a long time. This was my fault, but I'll never let him think that. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and rain-soaked clothes. The steady beep of machines filled the quiet hallway where Ethan sat, staring at the floor tiles. His hands were wrapped in gauze, a small cut traced across his cheek. But it wasn't the physical pain that had him trembling. It was the memory of the crash replaying in his mind again and again. Daniel was still unconscious in the ICU. The doctors said he had a fractured shoulder, a few broken ribs, and a concussion, but he'd live. He'll recover, they said. Ethan wanted to believe that. But every time someone asked what happened, his chest tightened. When the police came, Ethan stammered through his version of the story. He said the deer appeared out of nowhere, that the road was slippery, that he didn't remember much. He left out one small detail, that he was the one behind the wheel. Their parents were too shaken to notice. Their mother held Ethan close, whispering prayers under her breath. Their father kept pacing, rubbing his temple. When Daniel finally woke up 2 days later, the room was filled with relief, but not for long. The first thing he asked, his voice hoarse, was Ethan okay? He's fine. Their mother said softly, "You both are lucky." Daniel nodded weakly, but when his father stepped closer, something in his tone shifted. The officer said, "You swerved to avoid a deer, son." "You were driving?" Daniel froze. His mouth opened, but before he could speak, Ethan cut in quickly. "Yeah, he was. He was driving. I tried to grab the wheel to help, but..." Daniel turned to him, confusion flashing in his tired eyes. "What?" "No, Ethan." Ethan looked away, his jaw clenched. His lie was already out there, floating in the room like a ghost he couldn't take back. His heart pounded, guilt crashing through him, but fear spoke louder. Daniel didn't argue. He just stared at his brother, something fragile breaking behind his gaze. His lips pressed together, and he looked away. From that day forward, the air between them grew colder. At home, Daniel's recovery was slow and painful. Every movement reminded him of that night. But what hurt more than the cracked bones was the unspoken betrayal. The way his parents pitied Ethan instead of questioning him. Daniel kept quiet. Maybe he thought his brother would confess. Maybe he didn't want to make things worse. But silence, as it often does, started to rot everything around it. Ethan, meanwhile, couldn't escape his guilt. Every time he looked at Daniel's sling or the scars healing across his arms, he felt the weight of his lie pressing down. He wanted to say something, to tell the truth, but each day that passed made it harder. The story had already spread. Everyone in town thought Daniel had been driving, and Daniel knew that too. One evening, a month after the accident, Ethan stood by the barn watching the sunset burn through the clouds. Daniel walked up behind him, moving slower than before. His face was pale, but his voice was calm. "Ethan," he said quietly, "you sure that's the story you want to live with?" Ethan froze. The words weren't angry, they were heavy, tired, full of something deeper. Regret, maybe. Disappointment. He didn't answer. Daniel sighed, the hurt showing in his eyes. Accidents happen, but lies, they stay. He turned and walked away, leaving Ethan with the echo of those words. That night, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The lie had protected him, but it had cost him something far greater. The bond they once shared, the brotherhood built on laughter and trust, now felt fragile, like glass that had already cracked. And deep down, Ethan knew this was only the beginning. Time moved forward, but the space between Daniel and Ethan never closed. 3 years had passed since the accident, yet the memory of that night hung in the background of their lives like an unfinished song. The farmhouse they once filled with laughter had grown quiet. Daniel had changed, not just physically, though the scars on his shoulder told their own story. He had grown distant, more serious. After his recovery, he'd taken a job in town as a mechanic, spending long hours at the garage. He barely came home except to sleep. Ethan stayed behind, finishing high school, helping their father on the farm. He'd grown taller, stronger, but his eyes still carried that same haunted look. The guilt he'd learned to hide behind nervous smiles and tired jokes. When they did speak, it was only about small things, the weather, the crops, bills. but never that night. Their mother tried to bridge the gap, inviting Daniel to family dinners, asking Ethan to apologize for whatever it is between you two. But neither of them could find the right words. The silence had built walls around their hearts. Daniel wasn't cruel, he didn't yell or accuse. That somehow made it worse. His quiet acceptance, his calm distance, it cut deeper than anger ever could. Ethan sometimes caught him looking at him with something like sadness, maybe even pity, and it made him sick with shame. One autumn evening, the family gathered for their mother's birthday. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and coffee, candles flickering softly. Ethan had spent all day trying to act normal, smiling through the tension. But when Daniel arrived, a little late, something shifted. He walked in holding a small wrapped gift, a necklace their mother had once admired. Their mother smiled and hugged him tightly, tears shining in her eyes. For a moment, things felt almost like they used to. But as dinner went on, the conversation turned to driving. A neighbor's kid had just gotten his license. Their father laughed. "Hope he's better behind the wheel than you boys were that night." The table went quiet. Daniel's fork paused midair. Ethan's chest tightened. Their mother quickly changed the subject, but it was too late. The silence stretched again, sharp and heavy. Daniel excused himself first, muttering that he had an early shift. He hugged their mother, nodded at their father, and walked out without looking at Ethan. Ethan sat there frozen, staring at the half-eaten pie on his plate. His mother sighed softly and touched his hand. "You two were so close once. Don't let that go forever." That night, Ethan went to the old barn, the one where they used to play as kids. The rain started again, soft at first, then harder. He looked at the dusty shelves, the old baseball gloves, the drawings they'd made on the wall years ago. He whispered into the darkness, "I'm sorry, Danny," but Daniel wasn't there to hear it. The next morning, Ethan found an envelope on the kitchen counter. Inside was a photograph, the two of them as kids, holding fishing rods, grinning from ear to ear. On the back, Daniel had written just one line. "Some things are hard to forget, but not impossible to forgive." It wasn't a truce, not yet. But it was something, a small crack in the silence. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a flicker of hope, faint, uncertain but alive. He realized that maybe, just maybe, the story between him and his brother wasn't over yet. It was late summer when Ethan finally decided he couldn't carry the weight any longer. The guilt had become part of him, woven into his voice, his smile, the way he avoided his brother's eyes. Every time Daniel came home, Ethan would find an excuse to stay outside, fixing the fence, washing the tractor, anything to avoid being in the same room. But that evening, something inside him snapped. It started with a phone call. Their father had fallen in the barn and injured his leg. Daniel rushed home from town, still wearing his grease-stained work shirt. Ethan was already there, helping their mother bandage the wound. The moment Daniel walked in, the tension was almost physical. Two worlds colliding under one roof again. "Is he okay?" Daniel asked, kneeling beside their father. "He'll be fine," Ethan said quickly. "Just a sprain." Their eyes met for the first time in months. Neither spoke, but both felt the storm brewing. Later, after their father was resting and their mother had gone to bed, Daniel stood outside on the porch, staring out into the fields. The sky was streaked with the last glow of sunset, the cicadas humming in the tall grass. Ethan stepped out, his hands in his pockets, his heart pounding. "Danny," he began softly, "I need to say something." Daniel didn't turn around. "You don't owe me anything, Ethan." "Yes, I do," Ethan said, his voice trembling. You've been carrying the blame for something that wasn't your fault. Daniel turned then, his expression unreadable. You mean the accident? Ethan nodded. I was driving that night. For a moment, the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. Daniel's jaw tightened, his eyes searching Ethan's face. I know, he said finally. Ethan blinked. You knew? Daniel sighed, leaning against the porch railing. Of course I did. You think I couldn't tell? You were 17, scared out of your mind. I saw it in your eyes before you even opened your mouth. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Then why didn't you say anything? Why let me lie all this time? Daniel looked out at the darkening fields. Because Mom and Dad needed someone to believe it wasn't their youngest fault. Because you already looked like you were punishing yourself enough. Ethan's voice cracked. But I ruined everything between us. Daniel shook his head slowly. No, the lie did. You just didn't know how to let it go. Tears filled Ethan's eyes. I'm sorry, Danny. I was stupid, scared. I didn't want them to hate me. Daniel finally turned fully toward him, his face softening. They never would have hated you, Ethan. You were a kid. We both made mistakes that night. The two brothers stood there in silence for a long time, the air thick with memories. Then Daniel took a step forward and placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. I don't care about the truck or the scars, he said quietly. I just wanted my brother back. Ethan broke down, his shoulders shaking as years of guilt poured out in a single sob. Daniel pulled him into a hug, not the kind that fixes everything, but the kind that says we're still here. In that moment, something finally broke free. The lie that had haunted them both for years dissolved into the night air, leaving behind the raw, painful truth. And with it, the first real chance to heal. Later that night, Ethan sat alone in the barn, staring up at the wooden beams above. For the first time, the silence didn't feel heavy, it felt peaceful. He whispered softly to himself, "It's over." And in his heart, he knew Daniel had forgiven him long before he'd found the courage to ask. After that night on the porch, something shifted between Daniel and Ethan, not instantly, but gradually, like dawn breaking after a long storm. The air that once felt heavy with guilt now carried a fragile calm. The kind that comes after truth has finally been spoken. For the first time in years, Daniel stopped avoiding home. He started coming by more often, fixing the old fences, helping their father in the fields. Sometimes he'd bring coffee for Ethan early in the morning, the two of them sitting quietly by the porch steps as the sun climbed over the horizon. They didn't talk much about the accident anymore. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't cold now. It was gentle, filled with unspoken understanding. Ethan had changed too. The guilt that once haunted his every thought began to fade, replaced by something else, responsibility. He started taking over more of the farm work, volunteering in town, and even helping younger kids learn how to drive safely. He said it helped him give back. One evening, the brothers were repairing a section of fence when Daniel suddenly asked, "You still think about that night?" Ethan hesitated. Sometimes, but not like before. Daniel nodded. Good. You can't spend your life looking in the rearview mirror. You'll crash again. Ethan smiled faintly. Wes, I learned that the hard way. Daniel chuckled. A sound Ethan hadn't heard in years. It felt like a small victory. Weeks passed, and the family slowly began to feel whole again. Their mother, who had sensed the tension for so long, seemed lighter. She'd hum while cooking, sometimes watching the brothers with quiet relief. Their father, too proud to say it out loud, often smiled when he saw them working side by side. But the real turning point came when Daniel surprised Ethan one afternoon with a set of car keys. "Come on," he said. "Let's go for a drive." Ethan froze. He hadn't driven since the accident. Just sitting behind a steering wheel made his chest tighten. "Danny, I can't." "Yes, you can." Daniel tossed the keys into his hand. "You won't move on until you do." They got into Daniel's new truck. Different model, same old roads. Ethan's hands trembled as he started the engine. For the first few miles, neither spoke. The sound of tires against gravel was the only thing filling the air. When they reached the ridge road, the same one where it all happened, Ethan slowed down, his heart pounding. The memory came rushing back: the rain, the headlights, the deer, the crash. But this time, there was no storm. The sky was clear, painted with orange light from the setting sun. Daniel looked at him. "You okay?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think so." They stopped near the old guardrail, now repaired and rusted over time. Daniel leaned out the window, staring at the place that had once changed everything. "Funny," he said softly. "I used to hate this road." Ethan managed a smile. "Me too." Daniel turned to him, eyes calm and warm. "But look at us now. We made it back." Ethan took a deep breath, the kind that feels like freedom. "Yeah," he said, voice breaking just a little. "We did." As they drove home under the fading light, Ethan realized something profound. Forgiveness wasn't a moment. It was a process. It was choosing to move forward again and again, even when the past tried to pull you back. And for the first time since that stormy night years ago, he felt whole. A year passed, and life had quietly found its rhythm again. The scars were still there, faint reminders of the night that had once torn their family apart. But they no longer defined them. Daniel had expanded his small town garage into a full-fledged auto repair shop. He'd hired 2 young mechanics and often mentored them the same way he once guided Ethan. People trusted him, not just with their cars, but with their stories. He had become someone steady, dependable, and quietly kind. Ethan, now in his early 20s, had taken over most of the farm work. He'd grown more grounded, more patient. Some days, he still caught himself drifting back to that night. But the memories didn't crush him anymore. They just reminded him how far he'd come. The brothers weren't just close again. They were partners in every sense of the word. On weekends, Daniel would help Ethan with chores, and in return, Ethan would lend a hand at the shop. They'd joke, argue, and tease like they used to, the old bond rebuilt through shared effort and quiet forgiveness. One afternoon, Daniel received an invitation in the mail. A local driving school wanted him to give a talk about road safety and handling fear after trauma. He almost declined, but Ethan encouraged him to go. "You should," Ethan said. "You've got something worth saying." Daniel smirked. "You think so?" Ethan laughed. "Well, considering I'm living proof you survived teaching me to drive, yeah." The day of the event, the hall was filled with teenagers. Some excited, some nervous, all of them listening as Daniel stood in front of them. He spoke about responsibility, about choices, about how a single moment could change everything, and how forgiveness could change it back. When the session ended, a few students stayed behind to thank him. As Daniel walked toward the exit, he saw Ethan waiting by the truck outside, leaning against the hood with a grin. "How'd it go?" Ethan asked. Daniel shrugged, smiling. "Not bad. Didn't crash the speech." They both laughed. Then Daniel grew quiet for a moment, looking at his brother. "You know, I think that accident taught me something I couldn't have learned any other way." Ethan raised an eyebrow. Yeah. What's that? That sometimes life breaks things so you can rebuild them stronger. Ethan nodded slowly, taking that in. Guess that means we turned out all right then. Daniel smiled, tossing him the keys. Drive us home. Ethan caught them without hesitation. Yeah, he said with a small smile. I think I can handle that. The truck rolled down the familiar road, the same one that had once been a symbol of pain, now just another path under a bright, open sky. The air through the window was warm, the fields glowing gold in the late afternoon sun. Ethan glanced at his brother beside him, relaxed, content, and realized something beautiful. The accident hadn't ended their story. It had only rewritten it. And this time, they were both behind the wheel. Life doesn't always give us second chances, but when it does, hold on to them. Daniel and Ethan found theirs, not in forgetting the past, but in forgiving it. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that remind us what it truly means to be human. Because sometimes the hardest roads lead to the most beautiful destinations.